Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you. Today we are speaking with Reverend Jennifer Schaus Green. Jennifer is an ordained elder in the Upper New York Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. She was ordained a deacon in 1998 and an elder in 2002. Reverend Green got her B.A. from Lycoming College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, in Psychology and Religion, and a Master of Divinity from Candler School of Theology, Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She has served various appointments within the United Methodist Church, Belfast UMC and Canandaigua UMC, Lyndonville UMC, and currently serves Hilton United Methodist Church since 2008. She and her husband Troy have 4 children, William, Trent, Nicholas, and Catherine. They enjoy hiking, fishing, and playing board games as a family. Jennifer has a passion for sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with others and helping others to connect their own lives within the greater story of God's story.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Jennifer. You are the pastor at Hilton United Methodist Church in Western New York. Can you give our listeners some insight into how you came to enter the ministry and what it means to you? And how do you see your service to your congregation and the community?
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today. I actually received a call to ministry when I was in 7th grade. I had had a year of a lot of deaths in my family. So my grandfathers died 6 weeks apart. And I watched my parents go through that grief and really struggle in terms of their marriage and in the difference in how they were working through that process. And then that spring, that fall, it was summertime. It was my first day of 7th grade that my second grandfather died. So I just entered junior high and all of those feelings. Then that fall, my great grandmother died on my dad's side. And in the spring, our great aunt, who actually my daughter is named after, she was Rosie the Riveter during World War II, and just an amazing woman, and like a grandma to me. She had no biological grandchildren, died, and I was sitting in her funeral, and at the front was a woman pastor. I had never experienced a woman pastor up until that point. And I remember thinking, is this what you want me to do, God? Because of course it's 7th grade, so you start that career conversation and all those kinds of things. And really it was this distinctive, like, this is what I want you to do. So I've often felt that grief and funerals are a really huge part of my ministry because that's how it all started. And I explored being a teacher and other things, nurse, doctor, but always came back to pastoral ministry. So that is kind of my call story and how I came to be. And I've served a couple of different churches, but have been in the Hilton community for 12 years, which is somewhat unheard of for a United Methodist pastor. But we're going to take it as long as we can get it, because of our children in the school district. But really, my husband is also very involved in the fire department. So our ministry together is between the fire department and the church. And John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, said the world is my parish. And I really feel that way. Like, I am not just the pastor for the congregation and the people who might set foot into Hilton United Methodist Church, but I really try to be a presence for and a pastoral presence for the community, and often am called upon by the local funeral home to do services for people who might not have a church home.
Are you finding that more people now do not have a church home than did when you were, say, in junior high?
I don't know about that, because I don't know that I was so aware of that. And even from my beginning part of ministry, when I was pastoring down in the Southern Tier in Belfast, New York, I would do an unchurched person's funeral at least once a week. And while I was there in my 4 years of serving that community, I did 6 suicide funerals. So, but all of those people, one of them was a church member. The rest all did not have church homes. So I don't know that it has changed dramatically, although statistics tell us that there is quite a change in people not necessarily claiming a certain denomination or a certain congregation as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I must say, we've spoken a couple of times, Jennifer, and you are so energetic, upbeat, and positive, and I personally find that very refreshing in a minister. I know when I was a child, I was raised Episcopalian, and our services and everything were always somber. Yet I've attended a couple services at your church and others with other denominations, and contemporary services now seem to me to be so much more filled with positivity and hope that I find very, very refreshing. Our topic today is grief and belief. And it seems in today's world, there's more separation among families, among communities regarding our religious beliefs. I think people seem to be a lot more outspoken about what they do or do not believe,
Yes.
Whether they're more comfortable in that social environment or not. And I see a lot of separation, almost like discussing politics. You know, it's one of those things that you don't necessarily want brought up at the dinner table because you don't know what can happen. So with the death of a loved one, when everybody needs to come together and support each other is so important. How might these differences impact the grief process?
Yeah, I think that it can impact the grief process so much. And I'd like to use an illustration from my own life. And that was when my grandmother passed away. I was a first year pastor, so I had just begun pastoral ministry and serving a congregation. But it had been brought up in the church. So I had this lifelong belief of resurrection and new life after death. My mom's sister and her children did not necessarily have that. In fact, my cousin came to me once and said, and she's about 8 years older than I am, said, "Why do I need God when I have everything I need?" So in the midst of gathering together to celebrate grandma, to grieve together, there really was a difference because they were devastated because they were unable to see or experience something or have hope in the midst of that death process, which is common, I think, for people who are not Christian or have some sort of sense of there's something after the death. But my brother and I seem to have hope and try to celebrate grandma's life and her new life. So we could have had that be a real point of contention within us. I think that I see in families where people who are well-meaning and religious, they tend to want to impose that belief on others, and then it causes confusion and more than that, sometimes anger and to think of a good word for it, but just disparity within the family. And then we're questioning each other's grief because grief is beyond, we experience grief whether we believe or not. And I think that's important for people to know that grief is not rooted in our belief, but how we experience that grief might be different because of our belief.
Yeah, no, it definitely, like I've heard of it, I've seen it, that some families it just causes, estrangement.
That's the word I wanted.
There you go. I realize some people detail and plan for their own funeral process and preferences prior to their death. And in those cases, does it make that division any easier to resolve for families?
I don't know that I have a direct answer for that, but I would say in my experience, I've watched that be better because people are able to say, well, this is what mom wanted, or this is what dad wanted. And and you know what they want. You don't have someone imposing their own wants on the family. And because somebody might say, who hasn't planned ahead, the children or grandchildren or whoever happens to be in charge of the service might say that's what they wanted or they knew that. But when it's been pre-planned, which I really encourage people to do, to not be afraid of that. I think people are so afraid of death sometimes that they don't want to pre-plan because maybe they're speaking something into being. Well, the reality is we all are going to die eventually. So I really encourage people to write that down, keep it in a safe space so that their wishes can be carried through. And I think it does cause less tension with the family, especially with a good funeral director. They can say, this is what we're going to do. My brother-in-law, who is single and in his 50s, has a complete notebook with everything he wants for his funeral, because it could be a point of contention in our own family, because we do have varying beliefs within our family as well. And he is a believer, but other sisters and other people within the family aren't necessarily. So it's going to help when that time comes for him to have pre-planned and to have something written down in a safe place.
I think something else it does too is it makes it easier, even if there's no division or differing beliefs in a family, it makes it easier for the person who is kind of left to make those choices.
Yes.
I know my mother did it with a local funeral home, and it made it so much easier for me and for my brother, who came from out of state, because all of those decisions had already been made. The funeral director knew what the choices were and kind of guided us through it. We only made one change, and that was, instead of since she had moved from assisted living to a nursing home, she was no longer able to attend church services per se, but would attend the chapel services at the nursing home. So we changed it. Instead of having services at the church she had been a member of, it was only for like 4 or 5 years, we had service at the nursing home in the chapel.
Yeah.
And I think that was just a much better representation of her beliefs and everything like that. But my point, I ramble, but the point was that it makes it easier for the people that need to plan that funeral. And it does take a lot of pressure off them at a time when grief is just really overwhelming them and they're beginning to see what's involved.
Yeah, I would share. My father 2 years ago died 2 days before Christmas. So we were in the midst of Christmas and we had small children. So we're trying to keep things somewhat upbeat about Christmas, because we don't want to ruin Christmas for them for the rest of their lives. But we were in shock.
Yeah.
And we somewhat knew that was going to happen, but still there's just this shock. And to have some things that were already planned was extremely helpful, to just be able to say to the pastor, this is the hymn we're going to use. This is what we're going to do.
Right.
Yes, I've watched my mom go through both avenues of that with my grandmother. I think the only decision literally we had to make for grandma's funeral was what kind of flowers. So it was, and she always talked about it to me. You know, I've planned my funeral. She was like, oh, I just went and purchased my coffin. And I was like, Grandma, that's so morbid. Yeah. And it was, you know, I like we didn't talk about death. You didn't do that. And I was like, oh, this is crazy. My grandmother, she's planned her death. Like, you know, but it really, watching my mom having to go through that, and it was done. And then at the other side, I had to watch her completely plan every little detail. Mm-hmm. And because of that shock and numbness that you have, I know she bounced a lot of ideas off of me to make sure she was thinking correctly, and, you know, it would be okay for everybody involved, all family members. So if you haven't done so, I highly recommend it. Make sure that you have things planned. It's so much easier for your family members. It's not morbid.
Yeah. And Stephanie, I would add, not just with the funeral home, but if you happen to attend a church, sit down with your pastor. Mm-hmm. I've had some people come in and say, this is what I'd like. I might not be here, but we put it in a file and we put it to the side so it's there. but also a trusted friend, a colleague, or somebody who can assist in that if you're not if you don't belong to a congregation.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think it's one of those things that should be just as important as like telling your family members about, your DNR and stuff like that.
Yes.
I think this should also be part of the life process. So in the cases where there's no planning and immediate family are at odds, who makes the final decision? And what can you suggest as far as helping people better understand how they might compromise to support each other?
Yeah, I was thinking about this because I think it really depends on the family who makes the final decision. I would say this is just my own personal opinion and personal thought process. But if it is a spouse, I think the spouse or partner needs to make that decision. If there's a partnership of some sort where there's not a marriage, I think that partner needs to be a part of that decision. And if there's an oldest child or children, they really need to designate somebody who can make those decisions. I have experienced where there is no children and the spouse or partner is also deceased. So then you have a niece or a nephew or someone making some of those decisions. So it really, perhaps it's important for people to designate somebody that can make those decisions and do some of that pre-planning and say, this is who I want to make this decision. And if this person's unavailable, maybe we need a backup as well. It's like doing a bequest per se when we're filling out our life insurance or that kind of thing. So I think when a family's at odds, that is such a difficult situation that I'm not sure that there's a real answer for that. But I do think people have to realize that everyone and be aware that everyone is at a different place in the grief process, even at those first few days after the death, and be understanding of that and give one another grace. And I can't emphasize that enough. I think it's much easier to say than to do, but not always demand your way, but be open to the fact that there might be a better or different way that can yield the same results and really celebrate who that person has been in your life and the legacy that they're leaving. So I would say I guess that would be what I would say about that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as you were talking about designating someone, it prompted a thought in my head that maybe there should be a movement, and maybe you want to start it as your legacy, that just like there's a healthcare proxy, you could have an end of life proxy or something similar, that this is the person that's going to be responsible for making decisions that have to be made that you have not previously conveyed your wishes for. That, I think, would resolve a lot of issues for a lot of families. And I know that there are so many creative people in our world. And every so often I hear of an alternate concept for a memorial or other remembrance that might help span the difference in beliefs. For example, the loss Stephanie was referring to was the somewhat recent loss of my husband about 2.5 years ago, who was a Vietnam veteran. So I knew without a doubt, knowing my husband well, that there was a certain military component to his funeral that was necessary. So I got, well, I won't say really creative, because I've been to a number of military funerals, even the very formal ones at Arlington. But he was a member of the local Vietnam Veterans chapter, and they have an honor guard. Mm-hmm. And I had requested the honor guard come to the funeral and do their thing. What I wasn't prepared for was when they put the call out to membership, that there were over 50 of them. Wow. That came both for calling hours and for the funeral itself. I wasn't prepared for it. It was a very emotional component of his service. But when their spouses offered a last salute, and each of these gentlemen individually came up for a last salute instead of collectively, you could have heard a pin drop. Yes, it extended the length of the service, but it really impressed upon people how important military service was to him,
Yeah.
how many lives he had impacted with his membership and his duty. And it turned out to be a beautiful, beautiful addition to the service.
Wonderful.
I got many, many comments on it.
Right.
But thinking of creativity, and I can't really take credit for any of that, but I know that there might be something really different. So what have you seen in your ministry? Maybe a service that's held in kind of a unique place, or a part of a service that maybe somebody brought in, whether a custom or tradition from another religion or another culture. What have you seen that you can offer that might help somebody else think of something unique that they might want to do?
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of different things happen, and one of the most unique I've experienced is someone put the ashes of their husband in, and I can't remember directly if it was like the engine of a motorcycle, or like like the cover on a motorcycle engine, or if it was a helmet. But he was a scuba diver and he loved motorcycles. And so they put that in and then they released it into the ocean.
Oh.
Now, I'm not sure about like EPA standards for that, but I thought that was so unique to really honor who he was and to have something like that. Now she doesn't necessarily have a grave to go to and things, but I think once you see, every time you see the ocean, that is very much a part of things. I would share that at my dad's funeral, he worked for NYSEG for 40 years as a line mechanic. And his big thing was turning on the lights in the middle of the night and watching a whole street light up, and how he knew that was helping people and things. So we had arranged for the line trucks to come, sort of like they do for firefighters, and they flew a flag from that. So utilizing someone's career, and it doesn't have to be military or firefighter service or police service to be able to utilize their career in some way to celebrate. For my husband's grandparents, they died very close together and did not have a church, had lived in Georgia. And so we used the local fire hall and we gathered together to have a brief service and then to share a meal together. And my husband's grandmother refused to have any service. And but the grandchildren who she had brought up, many of them, they lived so close that they were in and out of her home all the time. They were really grieving and in need of a way to express that grief and to share with one another and gather with one another. So we just arranged for a luncheon at a local restaurant we just had a private room at a restaurant and ordered meals and just shared stories about grandma. And that actually, talk about contention. My husband's aunt would not talk to the cousin who had arranged for that because grandma didn't want anything. And how dare they do that? But I think it was really important and they've worked through that. It took time, but they've worked through that. But I think it was really important for those grandkids to gather in that way. And it was very simple, very informal, but a way for people to gather and just express what they needed. And another creative option, and this again, I keep using my dad's service, is there are 7 grandchildren in our family. My husband and I have 4, and my brother and his wife have 3 children. And we found things that were important to my dad. And so the oldest grandchild carried his ashes in, which was our oldest son. And then my dad always loved circus peanuts. So someone had a bag of circus peanuts. He always had mirrored sunglasses. So someone had the sunglasses. And my dad's belt, his climbing belt. Someone, of course, the smallest grandchild got the climbing belt, right? but they brought those in and placed them in remembrance. And I think that was, each kid picked what they wanted to bring in. And I thought that was it was not my idea. I thought it was a pretty creative way. And that's something that people of any belief can do, to pick some things that really are important. I've used, for services I've done, and I knew the person was really into motorcycles or other things. I've found fabric, and I've just decorated a table with those images to celebrate people and what they stood for, and how the legacy they're leaving in our own lives. So those are some things that I've seen and experienced.
I love that idea with the children. I really do. It's so touching. And I think that's so much better than just leaving the children at home.
Yes. Whoa.
Which was what happened in my generation.
Yes.
Hence probably why one reason I was never ready to talk about death. But I just love that idea, and it does prompt so many things. I remember, again, at my husband's funeral, his best friend came up to the podium to just say a few words. He had a cup of Tim Hortons coffee in his hand. Every day my husband went to Tim Hortons for coffee. So there might have only been a handful of people in that room that understood that. But for me, it was instant smile and something that was so ready. And Stephanie, do you remember the Post-it notes?
For Grandma, yes.
From Grandma's funeral?
Yes.
We were at the funeral home, and her 3 granddaughters, there are 4, but I can't remember, maybe Kelly was just a little bit too young, but her 3 granddaughters remembered that Grandma always had Post-it notes and would leave notes on every little knickknack in her china cabinet. On the bottom was a Post-it note who gave it to her to make sure that they got first choice after she died. So here we are at calling hours, and the oldest of the granddaughters pulls out a Post-it pad from her purse, and they wrote notes and stuck them underneath the end tables at the funeral home. So, yeah. Those things, not only are they important at the time, but years later, they prompt memories that you talk about and laugh about. So I think those things are great ideas. Thank you.
Well, and you had said something about the children, and I think that that's a topic that people need to hear as well, because I think often we want to leave the children at home because we don't know that they can deal with what's happening. Part of it is we're dealing with our own stuff and our own grief, and so it's harder to supervise children and that kind of thing. As a mother of 4, I totally get that, but I do think that children need to be included, and whether they are included as a part of the service, whatever that celebration looks like. I have read storybooks that are grief related during a service, kind of almost had a children's moment when their children, and brought them forward and talked with them. I've met with children individually before or after a service, but to have children a part of the service not only includes them in the grief process, but where else are they going to learn unless we include them as children? A part of learning is doing and experiencing. And if they can have a somewhat positive experience of that as a child, I think it will help them immensely, because grief will happen throughout their entire life. And and it might not be the death of a loved one. It might be the grief of a relationship that is ending, or a job loss, or a pet.
Yeah, very common one.
And I think it's great that kids have funerals. We had a goldfish. It was a carnival goldfish that lived for 4 years. We named it Dorothy, like Elmo's Dorothy. And when Dorothy died, my kids had the idea of planting Dorothy, basically burying Dorothy underneath a gold mum in our front garden. And so every year when that mum blossoms, we think of that goldfish. But I remember gathering around with the goldfish, saying a couple words for Dorothy. So I think that's even important, because pets can cause even for adults, the loss of a pet is a grief experience in many ways.
Yeah, we actually do have on our list of potential topics We do have an
Oh,
episode
awesome.
about helping children grieve
Yeah.
and kind of covering maybe the different age groups and how they handle grief and things
Yes.
you can do. So maybe
Wonderful.
you want to consider coming back.
Well, I know talking about the children, so, and this is at no fault whatsoever of my mom's. We've learned that there are different traditions and different ways of growing up, and you do what you've been taught. So
Mm-hmm.
you didn't talk about death. You didn't go to the funerals. Children didn't go to the funerals and things like that.
Yeah.
So I don't even know if I went to any funerals when I was growing up as a kid, Mom. I know when Grandma's husband, George, passed, we were out of state. So I remember that. That's really the only one I think I can remember from my childhood. But when I was 19 and worked at the University of Rochester, we had one of the men working in our department, his younger son passed away. And we went to calling hours, and I had never been. And I was with a friend of mine and I was like, what do we do? I don't know what we're supposed to do here. I haven't been to calling hours. I've never been to a funeral. I don't know, how am I supposed to act? What am I supposed to do? What's happening? So I think that, and then, the couple of funerals, well, Grandma's and then Tom's, bringing my boys so they can see it. It's not all somber. There's the memories. And I think those memories and talking about the person that you love is very important. And then even in your own home afterwards, talking about the good times and remembering them. So from that standpoint, letting the children come so they can just see what happens at calling hours or a funeral, because that awkwardness, going when you're an adult, you can just better prepare for it. I didn't know what to expect. And I didn't know this kid, and I lost it, just lost it, just the overwhelming sense that I had from it. But so I think it's important to try to involve them and ask the kids what they're comfortable doing too. Maybe they just want to go to some calling hours. Maybe they don't want to be at the funeral. I know for Tom's, they were, of course, at calling hours. They were at the funeral. But then our family, we went and had dinner afterwards. And the boys were like, I just want to go home. They had had enough. And that's fine. I wanted them to be comfortable too. And so anyways.
Yeah. Not making them do something they're not comfortable with. And I don't mean to derail or take on the next, when you do the topic about children, but one thing that I did with my kids, and I'm very grateful that either the Holy Spirit or somebody gave me this idea. When my kids' friends had grandfathers who died, we went to the calling hours, and part of it was being supportive of people who you care about. What I was trying to teach, but I also wanted them to experience that before it was somebody that they really, really were close to, and they had to experience it. And then my kids had a sense, and it might be that death happens and you don't have a chance to do that. We were able to do this, but my kids had a sense of what that calling hour would look like and would happen without having the pressure of their own grief or trying to entertain people or those kinds of things that happen during calling hours.
Right. It's about being there supporting your friend.
And that you might not know, Stephanie, that's so amazing. I mean, you didn't know this person, but you knew their father, and so, or mother. So sometimes that, from the other side of when we're not necessarily in that grief, part of going, you might not know the deceased, but if you know somebody who knows them, it's just really being there in support of them. And that, again, that goes across the belief spectrum. You do not need to believe, it's just being a kind and caring human being.
Right. So lastly, Jennifer, would you offer some personal thoughts to those who either aren't sure if or what they believe when considering the death of someone they love? What might help them find some comfort regarding an afterlife or such?
Yeah, I was reading this question ahead of time, and I was really struggling with this because for me, belief is so much a part of my life. Like I'm a pastor. I live church, and not that I want to emphasize that I have my own doubts and questions, and I really struggle sometimes, especially when I'm dealing with like the death of my father, or or those kinds of things. So it's not that people of belief aren't doubting and questioning. And I think maybe that's it. Maybe it's sitting in those doubts and questions and realizing that no one, and definitely God, but no one should be judging you for those doubts and questions. They are okay. And sometimes it's just sitting and just crying, that you can pray, but that prayer doesn't have to be this long eloquent thing. So if you have an inkling of a greater being of any way, the word help, or just, one word, I'm sad, or even this sucks. It's the I think that that's important for people to know, that we're all going to go through this grief process at one point in our life, and it might not be because someone has died. It might be for various reasons. Like we were kind of talking before we even began recording about, in the midst of COVID-19 and the pandemic, many of us are experiencing grief for the life that perhaps we knew and that we're unable to participate in now. Maybe relationships that we can't be as close with because our kids or our grandkids or our siblings are in other states and we can't get together. And all of that is grief. And for me personally, having that faith helps me through that. But if you don't have that faith, then knowing that it's okay to question, and it's okay to be angry, and that all of that gamut of emotions are all part of the human experience, and it does not make you less of a person, and it does not cause you to be any less. But I need to put this in here: God still loves you no matter what. That even if you are not a person of belief, I truly believe God still loves you. That's from my perspective as a pastor.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I loved your statement about it's okay to doubt, it's okay to question, because I think for so many people, they feel it's an either or, it's a yes or no, it's a black or white.
Yeah,
there can be no crossing. And truth is, there's a lot of gray. There's a lot of unknown. You can put whatever spin on it you want, but it's okay to have those feelings, whether you believe or not.
Yep.
I think our time is running short for today, Jennifer.
Yeah.
It's perfectly okay. I loved everything you said, whether you felt it was on topic or not. I think it was important. It did pertain to today's topic, and it's vital. And I often find that when I listen to a podcast, I'll be listening, I'll agree and everything. And all of a sudden there is one sentence or one phrase that is stated that will make me stop and say, yes. So I think it's very likely that some of those things that you felt might have been off topic could be just what someone needs to hear.
Okay.
So thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to do this. I hope we can get you to come back sometime, because I love the things you're saying and the perspective that you're offering us. I think it's great. And to our listeners, thanks so much for listening, for tuning in today. We hope that you heard something in this episode that will bring you back next week as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening with us today. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.